My name is Tod Bolsinger. I am from Fuller Seminary. This is where I live and work and have my being. I serve as an associate professor there of leadership formation. I run something called the Church Leadership Institute, and I also have a consulting company that works with churches in the middle of change. My life, every single day, I wake up to help faith leaders thrive as change leaders, and particularly function around the notion of how we lead change in a deeply disrupted world. So whenever the world disrupts and it gets hard, you'll be ready for it when it comes. That was a joke. So far I'm hitting it really, really well. So let me jump in. I have spent the better part of the last 13 years going around the country quoting my favorite quote on leadership. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. This is from Heifetz and Linsky. They are leadership professors and consultants who work out of Harvard University. And what's important about this definition is that it actually helps us understand why leadership is so hard. So at the seminary where I serve, I was actually one day in the middle of a meeting where our Old Testament professor said in the meeting, I'm not even sure why we teach leadership in a seminary. It's really hard from the scriptures to basically create a good theology or philosophy of leadership. If you want to be blunt about it, really the only thing that you can say is in the Old Testament, when God is leading, things are okay. When humans lead, not so much, right? So where we find ourselves is trying to think about leadership. And this is what I do every single day. And here's what I basically begun to think about. To try to understand biblical leadership, faithful leadership in our context, one of the things you need is a biblical concept that is all the way through the Bible, and that you can start with that. And that concept is the concept of management. It's hard to look up management in the concordance, but if you think about stewardship, you're on the right track. What management and stewardship is taking care of the things entrusted to your care, Scott Cormode likes to say, and handing them over to other people who will be trustworthy also. So if you become the pastor of a church and you've got a lovely facility like this and a group of people who show up and you are handed the scriptures and you are handed a budget and resources, your job, if you are a good steward, is to make sure that these resources and the scriptures and all the things we have are functioning for the purpose they were given and the reason why people came. And if you do that well and hand that over to other people, they are grateful. Management is about taking care of the people entrusted to your care, the things entrusted to your care. So when I was a senior pastor for 17 years down in San Clemente, and I was always looking for youth leaders, I realize now I was looking for youth managers. I was looking for people who would take care of these kids who we entrusted to them. You take 10 kids to camp, you got to bring 10 kids home. 90% is not an A, right? The hard part about leadership is that leadership is when you are called upon where people have to go through a transformation in order to accomplish the thing you have. Leadership happens when people tell you that they ask you to lead them someplace, they're committed to it, they're excited about it, and then they resist you. That's what makes leadership so hard, where you walk in and they ask you to please help us reach our neighbors, please help us plant churches, please help us live out the gospel. And as soon as you give them a plan, they resist. That's when you need leadership. And you find that you are disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. And for many of us, this last season that we have just been in has been one of the most difficult seasons ever to lead. Let me just say, I don't think this is the hardest time in Christian leadership ever, or the hardest place. I actually think that if you were trying to lead a church in Ukraine right now, it would be harder than trying to lead a church through the pandemic. But it has probably been the most complicated time. Somebody said we are in 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We have been in a health crisis that has led to an economic crisis, that has led to a political crisis that has been fueled by crises of social injustice and division in our churches. And recently, if you consider the things happening in Russia and Ukraine, it's like you can add 1939 into that as well. No one has ever had to lead the church through this complicated of a time. And that's why, for so many of us, this has been so difficult. If you've seen the most recent reports, that have come out about how clergy have experienced the pandemic. You know that 2020 was one of the very most discouraging years ever for clergy. More clergy thought about retiring or leaving the ministry during 2020 than any other year on record until they got to 2021. And 2021 was worse. Almost 40% of all clergy said if they could have any other job they could do, they would do it, and they would consider leaving. And amongst those under 45, it's almost 50%. It is leadership is hard. And for many of us, it feels exhausting. I don't know if you know the work of a poet named David Whyte. David Whyte was once on a private retreat with a monk named Brother David Steindale-Rast. He was in the middle of his own kind of vocational crisis. And poet David looked at monk David and said, "Brother David, tell me about exhaustion." The monk paused for a second and said, "You know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. What is it then? The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness." He goes on to say, "You are so tired through and through because you are half here, and half here will kill you after a while. You need something to which you can give your full powers. You must do something heartfelt, and you must do it soon." Let me just pause here to say that if you hear anything in the next few minutes that sounds as if what I am saying is, "Oh, try harder. Suck it up, buttercup. This is really, really important. Just dig in. Come on, you can do it," you're missing the point. That's not what I mean by wholehearted. What I mean is you need something to which you can give your full self to because you are called to it and equipped for it, ready for it, given it. That you are like Moses standing in front of the burning bush, and as Ruth Haley Barton said, you had that moment where the Spirit of God speaks to you and says, "This is yours to do." And you know that you want to take up that moment. That's what it means to be wholehearted. And what I want to introduce you to today and this afternoon is a different way of leading than we have been taught that will help us be more wholehearted about leading through this moment of deep disruption and change. Because this is the way I define leadership. Leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the world. You are in the leadership zone when everybody has to be transformed for you to get where God is calling you to go. You know that you are not going to be able to get there with the capacities that you have. You need God to do something in your life and transform you. That's when you know you're in the leadership zone. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Forgive me if you're not a fan of history, but I'm a little bit of a history buff. So let me take you back. Twice today, I'm going to take you back into American history. First, August 12th, 1805. Meriwether Lewis, who was the leader of the Corps of Discovery, along with his partner, William Clark. Meriwether Lewis found himself on the border of Montana and Idaho, at the edge of what's called the Lemhi Pass. They had spent 18 months traveling upstream from St. Charles, Missouri, up the Missouri River, 18 months of hard paddling upstream. They found themselves at this tiny little spring. They took a drink out of the spring. They walked up to the side of the Lemhi Pass and looked over. For 300 years, people had waited for this moment. For 300 years, people had looked for this moment. For 300 years, going clear back to Europe, everybody was waiting to discover what they were about to discover, which was a way to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and create a water route that would go all the way through. If you are from European background, the most important economic thing you could do would be to claim a water route that would connect Asia and Africa to Europe. The mental model of Europe was this: we have all the people, they have all the resources. If we can get those resources to our people, well, then we'll have a great economic boom. And so the key to it is it's easier to move raw material over water than over land. So whoever claims the water route has the trade route. It'd be like owning the internet today. For 300 years, France, Spain, Portugal, and now the United States had been looking for this water route. 18 months of going upstream, trying to connect the Missouri River, that connects to the Mississippi River, that connects to the Gulf of Mexico, that goes out to the Atlantic Ocean. 18 months of trying to figure out where this connects to the Pacific Ocean. There's a Columbia River that comes out of Oregon. Ships had already gone up part of the way of the Columbia River. They just didn't know where it connected. Whoever could find this connection, what they called the Northwest Passage, would claim the water route. Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, as if he could, from France so that they could claim the water route. Meriwether Lewis, and from this tiny little spring that would become the Missouri River, he takes the drink, walks up to the side of the river, looks over, expecting to find a spring on the other side. After 18 months of paddling hard upstream, they were now getting ready to go downstream. They were going to put those boats into the river. They were going to float all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They were going to take a selfie and send it back to Thomas Jefferson. And they were going to claim themselves as the greatest explorers of their generation, those who discovered the Northwest Passage. And he walks up the side of the Lemhi Pass. He looks over to find the stream, and he sees the Rocky Mountains. They're canoers. They're trying to find a water route. How do you canoe over mountains? Now, here's the most interesting part of this story for me. They'd spent the winter with the Mandan tribe. The Mandan, they'd asked them, is there a river on the other side? And they said, yes, there's a river on the other side. And they said, oh, that's so great. Said, you're going to have to cross some mountains. They said, mountain schmountains. We're from Virginia. We're great at mountains. Anybody been to Shenandoah National Park? Anybody seen the Appalachian Mountains? Anybody seen the Shenandoahs? They're beautiful. They look like the first part of this picture. Nice little rolling hills. Oh yeah, that's what they thought a mountain was. They thought mountains were the front part of this picture. Oh yeah, you could imagine dragging a canoe over this. What they didn't have, what no white people had ever seen, was those mountains in the back. That this went up to 14,000 feet, that it would be 300 miles long, that a river couldn't make it through it, that they had come on a water route and now they were facing mountains. The other part of this story is they had seen in the distance the Rocky Mountains for 3 months. If you've ever been to western Kansas on a clear day, you can see the Rockies out there. But Meriwether Lewis had written in his journal, I refuse to believe this will be anything but a safe and comfortable passage because denial runs really, really deep. They found themselves at this moment and realized at this moment that 300 years of mental model about the way the world works was wrong. They assumed everything in front of them would be like everything behind them. And that if you have been successful in the past, all you got to do is just keep paddling harder. And if you work hard and have people going in the right direction and are committed to a vision and you are going there, all you got to do is just keep going. Except they were canoers. And they found themselves facing a mountain. And the world was completely different. The world in front of them was completely different than the world behind them. And that's where the church is today. We have found ourselves completely disrupted, not just by COVID. We've been being disrupted for the better part of 50 years by a move from Christendom to post-Christendom, to where the world no longer gives us as Christians a home court advantage. I served at Hollywood Presbyterian Church for 10 years. I served there during the 80s when it had about 4,000 members. But in 1963, it was the largest Presbyterian church in America. It had 9,000 members. And in 1963, there was an article in the newspaper that told everybody in Los Angeles about Hollywood Presbyterian Church, about how it was this amazing, big church filled with people and its coffers were filled, and how remarkable it was. The Los Angeles Times wrote an article on Hollywood Presbyterian Church. Somebody gave me the article because they know I'd served there. Why I kept it, however, is right below the article on Hollywood Presbyterian Church was a little box. And in that box, the Los Angeles Times printed a week's worth of daily Bible readings. If you can remember when the Los Angeles Times helped you with your morning quiet time, you can remember when Christianity had a home court advantage. When every little town in America had a town square, had a library, a courthouse, and the first church that got there first. First Baptist, First Lutheran, First Methodist. And all the other first churches, they were all on 2nd Street. Because everybody assumed that the way society was to be arranged was that at the center of it would be law, education, and religion. And that religion was Christian religion, even if people weren't Christians. In 1963, the Billy Graham Crusades were at an all-time high. People needed Jesus in 1963. But when they were welcomed into churches, they were welcomed into churches that were given a cultural advantage. That disruption that has been happening for a generation has now been accelerated by COVID. We now find ourselves leading in a territory that nobody has ever been to before and trying to figure out how to move forward. So all of our churches are sitting here at the Lemhi Pass, and we're trying to figure out, what do we do in this disrupted world? Some of us say, we went on this trip to be about discovery. We're trying to move into the future. We're trying to discover the future. But what we really discovered is that what we're really good at is canoeing. What we need to do is go back to comfortable terrain, go back to rivers that we're comfortable with. We need to tell stories about canoeing. We need to pass on the tradition of canoeing. We need to raise up a new generation of canoers. We need to go in circles back here in familiar territory and try to get as many people committed to canoeing as possible. We need to go backwards, we say. Others of our churches know that we're not called to go backwards. We're called to take the gospel forward. That we're called to go to all of the uttermost places of the world. We're supposed to bring the gospel to everybody, that until the day comes where the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever and ever and ever. We are to be faithful witnesses going into the world. And so we find ourselves staring at these mountains, knowing that we're great at canoeing, and asking ourselves, what are we going to do? And what we find at this moment is so many of us say, you know what, maybe we'll just stay right here. We'll just create a church Airbnb with a view. We'll look at the future and talk about the future and dream about the future. We won't go there or anything, but we'll do our best we possibly can. I got friends of mine who pastor in Denver, Colorado. They say in Denver, Colorado, the basic joke is this: Denver was founded by people who braved their way all across the Great Plains. Woke up one morning, looked at those Rocky Mountains and said, right here, far enough, we're stopping right here. And many of our churches and many of us as leaders, that's what we do. But when Meriwether Lewis looked over the Lemhi Pass, having been told that he was to find a water route, and saw that there was no water route, he didn't go back and he didn't get stuck. Instead, what he said was, we proceeded on. What will it take for us to be people who proceed on? The first thing I want you to recognize here is that we were not trained for this terrain. We are water people. We're canoers. And we find ourselves in a different day. I go around the country and I have many people who come up to me and say, you work at a seminary, right? Yes, I do. Here's what you need to know. The seminary didn't prepare me for what I'm facing today. It taught me a lot of good things, but not this. I would say, everybody who comes to a seminary, somebody said to them, you're like the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school. And they show up at a professional Christian school, and we make them write papers and read books. And when they're done, we give them a Master of Divinity. Does that sound like a superhero or what? And we send them back into churches, and people look at you and say, you are the one who is going to lead us. And we realize that we could lead them well if it was all about canoeing. And we get overwhelmed. Ed Friedman says, and here's a longer quote that I'll give you, and for those of you who are interested in the slides, I will give you a chance this afternoon to get all these slides and more. Ed Friedman writes, when any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, here's the first concept I want you to understand. You are leading a group of people who by God's decree and by human psychology function like a relationship system. We are first and foremost a family, a community, brothers and sisters. We function more like a family, a community, a tribe, a people than we do like an institution, organization, or movement. So because you are leading a relationship system that has a mission, that just doesn't have the capacity to just sit in a circle and enjoy being together, that this family reunion has to go out on the road. Because you are there, it often gets stuck. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, I love that phrase. Think about the last meeting you were in, the last committee meeting, the last brainstorming meeting, the last time that we're going to think about new ways to reach our neighborhood. And 30 minutes later, you're like, maybe we should do a concert. If you've never been in a meeting that's imaginatively gridlocked, let me invite you to a faculty meeting. The smarter people get, the harder it is for them to think about other categories. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, it cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. Do you know why we are so exhausted? Because we have been trying to paddle our way through the mountains. We've been trying to dig in and paddle in a river where there isn't any water. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. For a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, that's the phrase. That spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes, must happen first. Let me tell you what this means. What it requires at this moment, when you're staring out at the mountains, when you recognize that you brought a bunch of people who are good at rivers, that we don't have the capacity to move forward, we're going to have to go through a transformation. What it requires at this moment is a spirit of adventure, and how you know you are on an adventure is that adventures require learning, and they result in loss. This is what is different about today. You are all in positions of leadership because at some level someone said, you are a trustworthy expert. You will figure out the problem. You will help us get it figured out. We are here to follow you. And the very first thing you've got to recognize is now you need to lead in a different way. You need to be able to stand in front of your people and acknowledge that in this way, you are not the expert. You are off the map. And yet you know you are called to go forward, and it's going to require learning. For many of us, this is deeply disappointed because we thought we got that out of our system before we became the leader. We prepared to be the leader. Now we learned a lot. We got initials after our names. We did internships. We were on staff. We did lock-ins. Oh my gosh. And now we find ourselves in a place of leadership, and what we expect is that people will trust us and we'll just follow. And if we're honest, we know that we don't know what to do. It requires learning, and it results in facing loss. If you came on this trip because it's a canoe trip and that you like rivers and you're really, really good at it, Lewis and Clark were so good at river navigating, they invented a boat. And if all of a sudden they come back and tell you, by the way, we looked ahead and there ain't no water, that means we're going to have to drop your canoes. You're going to have to let them go. We might actually need to burn those canoes for firewood as we go through that snow. And the thing that you brought, the thing that gives you identity, the thing you're used to doing, the thing that got you this far, you now need to let go. And that's where the pain is. What Heifetz and Linsky and their colleagues help us understand is that the first thing you've got to do to be a pastor in this moment, to be a leader in this uncharted territory, is you've got to learn to diagnose your problems in front of you. And here's just a helpful way of understanding it that we use with, literally, right now our company and our institute are working with 100 churches around the country on developing the capacity to lead in this way. The first thing you got to do is know the difference between what's called a technical problem and an adaptive challenge. It's pretty simple. Technical problem, adaptive challenge. A technical problem is a problem an expert can solve. It doesn't mean that it's simple. It means that an expert can solve it. So when my father needed to have a valve replacement on his heart, we took him to the hospital where they invented the procedure. My dad was obviously very nervous. Open heart surgery or even invasive surgery of any kind is really scary. The man looks at my father and says, Mr. Bolsinger, I'll do 4 of these this week. I've done hundreds of these. I know what I'm doing. Technical problem, technical solution, expert can solve it. Flying a plane, technical solution, technical problem. Landing a plane, experts know how to do it. Preaching a sermon on the Trinity without committing heresy, without having to go to those heretical, crazy analogies like shamrocks and water and egg and stuff that we use. We teach you at a seminary how to actually preach on the Trinity without having to fall into heresy. It's hard, it's complicated, but you can learn how to do it. Technical problems, technical solutions, experts solve them with best practices. An adaptive challenge cannot be solved with one's existing knowledge, skills, and tools. It requires people to make a shift in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. How easily do people shift values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior? And how do you know which of those you shouldn't shift? Because if you give up certain values, attitudes, expectations, or habits of behavior, you compromise who you are. This is the realm of adaptive change. They are systemic problems with no clear answers. Technical problems are solved by experts. Adaptive challenges are solved by learners. Technical problems are solved with best practices. Adaptive challenges are solved by experimenting and learning as you go. And most of us weren't trained in that. Adaptive challenges require learning. Sound familiar? They result in facing loss. And they are about navigating competing values that are difficult, that you cannot solve with a win-win solution. If you find yourself in a moment where you're in a meeting, where you're trying to decide, so what are we going to do? What's going to be our first priority? Is our church going to be about loving and reaching our neighbors, or is it going to be about taking care of our members? And when a person looks at you completely trustworthy and says, can't we do both? And you know that at this moment, you need to be clear on what God's mission's for. What's first? Maybe we can do both, but what's going to be priority number 1? What's going to be priority number 2? And you have to help people make that hard decision. You know you are dealing with an adaptive challenge. What's most important post-pandemic? Bringing all of our members back together for worship? Or loving our neighbors whose lives have been just as disrupted as ours? Oh, we'll do both with diminished staff, diminished energy, diminished exhaustion. What's the first priority? Most of us learned leadership. The first book we learned was 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. It taught us to think win-win. Win-win in adaptive language is lose-lose. The hard thing, the disappointing thing, is being able to stand before your people and say, because of this mission, because of our mission, this will be our first priority. When I was a pastor in San Clemente, I had a couple show up in my office. They said, hey, we want to meet with you. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So they sit down and they said, so we are joining the next new members class. And I went, oh, great. They've been around the church for about 6 months. I'd gotten to know them. They're terrific. They're just the kind of people we wanted to be members. They're mature. They were amazing. I said, well, tell me how you got here. They said, well, For the last several years, we've been part of a big mega church that you would know in South Orange County, and we were involved there for a long time, and it was great, but eventually we started thinking that we needed to be part of something else where we could be more involved in a way that would transform us, deeper discipleship, closer community. It just didn't work for us anymore, so we left the church, and we started church hopping, and we were having a very hard time finding a church. And so we found ourselves very often just sitting home on a Sunday morning and trying to figure out how we get fed. And all of a sudden we discovered there was this preacher out there who was preaching about the way in which you could literally plant churches and share the gospel and reach into the community, and the way in which you could live out your faith in a way that people who didn't have faith would find it had credibility. And we started listening to this preacher, and we loved him, and we discovered that he was a Presbyterian. So what we did is we looked up Presbyterian churches, and we saw your church, and so we showed up the next Sunday, and we heard you preach. And we heard what you were saying is that your church was committed to reaching those folks who are disaffected, to trying to love our neighbor, to being missional in every way. And we went, oh my gosh, we're home. We found it, so we signed up for your new member class. But then one of our friends told us that we should probably investigate. We might not be comfortable being Presbyterians. And so we did, and so then we realized there's different kinds of Presbyterians. I said, who is the preacher that you heard? And they said, Tim Keller. I went, yeah, well, he's one of the greatest preachers in the world today. And he's in a different Presbyterian denomination. You didn't even know there was different Presbyterian denominations. And he said, we didn't. Do you think any of our neighbors know there's different Presbyterian denominations? No, but here's the point. The more we looked into your Presbyterian denomination, the more we thought people like us aren't going to be comfortable here. So here's what we came to ask you. Before we join the church, would you be willing to change denominations? And I looked at them and said, no. Because you're not our mission. Our mission is not to create a place where every Christian trying to find a church home finds a place that's perfectly aligned for you to be comfortable. We got all kinds of people in our midst who aren't sure if they're totally comfortable with everything. But what we're aligned around is our mission of loving our neighbors, reaching our friends, going into the neighborhood. That's our mission. You're not our mission. I think it was the first time in their lives they'd ever been told that as mature Christians, that they weren't the center of the mission. And then I looked at them and said, but I think what God did is brought you here for you to join our mission. And the husband looked at his wife and looked at me and said, honey, I think we're Presbyterians. And they joined our church. Competing values, mature couple, deeply involved, great to the church, would bless the church. Our mission that they may not entirely fit into. Which one do you choose? Pick one. Competing values. So here's the hardest thing, and this will set us up for this afternoon. Here's the hardest part about all this adaptive leadership stuff. Most of us became leaders because what we believed was this: if we're people of good integrity, and we're people of good character, and we're people who are faithful to the gospel and faithful to our people, and we have a high degree of trust, then they will follow us. Let's be clear, you need trust. If there is no trust, there is no transformation. And we are in a moment where the crisis of trust in Christian leadership is at an all-time high, right? If you find that your movement ends up in a podcast or in a documentary or in a 300-page report that is now on the front page of the New York Times, you have probably lost trust. So trust is really important. But when you go off the map, trust is not transformation. You have to invest trust in transformation. You have to look at people who aren't sure they want to go this way, and because they're being disappointed, because they came on this trip because it's a river trip, and because you've got to look them in the eye and say, we thought we were trying to find a water route, and what we're discovering is not a water route, but a whole new world. And we are inviting you to come. And trusting you, they will begin to let themselves let go of the canoes and begin to go forward. And the first principle of adaptive change is that people don't resist change they resist loss. When you are trying to lead a congregation, when you find them in a place where they are more than anything they say they want to do something and they're not doing it, when they find themselves overwhelmed in those moments and they begin to resist you, you look at them and say, you brought us here so that as the pastor or as the leadership team so that we could reach young families. And now here are the changes we need to make. And they look at you and say, wait a minute, we brought you here to help us reach young families. We didn't want to change anything else. We just thought if you're here, that would be enough. That's all we wanted to change. We wanted you. You be the pastor. That's what we need. We're Presbyterians. We're always thinking like, if we get rid of the word Presbyterian, we call ourselves the Flood. We get rid of like choirs and get a band and a smoke machine. If we just, if we do the things that then the younger generation, well, that'll be enough. Wildly not. You need to go through transformation. People don't resist change. They resist loss. And one of the hardest things to face is the loss of being able to stand in front of your people who expect you to be the leader with the answer and say what psychologists say are the three hardest words to say. Not I love you, and not I forgive you. It is I don't know. I don't know what's next. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't have a plan. What we are going to do together is discern that, lean into that, experience the Holy Spirit leading us through that. We're going to go through transformation together. We're going to take one step at a time. We're going to look out there and say, that is where we're going. We are in uncharted territory, and we need to go forward, and we're going to have to learn as we go. Eric Hoffer said, in times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. Perhaps the greatest challenge at that moment for Meriwether Lewis and William Clark was that they were men of the Enlightenment. They were men of their era. Meriwether Lewis had been tutored by Thomas Jefferson. He had been trained in the White House. They had the entire authority of the United States government in front of them. They had all the resources possible. They'd been trained with the highest amount of science and technology and military strength. And when they stepped off over the Lemhi Pass, they were lost. They were completely lost. No white people had ever been in this area before. Nobody of European descent had ever been here before. They didn't know what was, people wrote in the journals that they wondered whether they would find the dinosaurs there. And when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, they were lost. All of them were lost. Every one of them except one person. She was a teenage Native American nursing mother. In 11th grade history class, you probably learned her name as Sacagawea, but they wrote her name in the journals as Sakakawea, and I want to give her back her name. When they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, they were now in Shoshone territory, and she was Shoshone. At 11 or 12, she had been kidnapped and taken over the pass and had kept as an enslaved person in the Mandan tribe. They sold her, or she was won in a card game by the French trapper Charbonneau. When Lewis and Clark spent the winter there with the Mandan tribe, they got to know her, realized that she could be a great interpreter, and they paid Charbonneau to bring his wife with them, even though she was very pregnant. She gave birth to a baby right before they left. So anytime you think of the great explorers of the American West, these men who went over mountains and down rivers and faced down grizzly bears, remember, she did it too with a baby. And when they stepped over that Lemhi Pass, she was at home. This was not uncharted territory. She had the relationships. She took them to the Shoshone tribe. She interpreted for them. She vouched for them. The Shoshone were so grateful to bring back this little girl they thought who had been dead that they then supported. They sent an older man with Sacagawea and the Corps of Discovery to help make sure they made it through the mountains. They would never have made it without them. They realized in uncharted territory that what they needed to do was begin to learn from the people around them. Those who had neither power or privilege in Christendom are the trustworthy guides, the voices that we haven't had in leadership before, those who are now invited in because they know how to lead in this world. Dave Gibbons, who's a pastor in Orange County, says the future is here, it's just on the margins. And this is where we find ourselves today. You can't just depend upon your canoeing techniques of the past. You need to learn differently, lead differently, open yourself to listen to voices that you haven't used before, restructure so that there are new voices at the table bringing wisdom from this day and not just from the past, and learn to be a core of discovery, a community that learns as you go. Let me finish with my favorite story out of this whole thing. Sacagawea takes them to the Shoshone tribe. She starts interpreting for the tribal chief. In the middle of her interpretation, the tribal chief recognizes that this little girl is actually his sister. They realized at this moment that they brought this little girl had come back, the one who they thought was dead, and in great gratitude, they reached out and they supported and cared for the Corps of Discovery. They developed a partnership and a support where the Shoshone helped the Corps of Discovery make it through the mountains in a kind of cooperation that you wouldn't see again, maybe ever in the American West. They finally make it through the mountains, 300 miles through the mountains, through hip-deep snow in places. They come out of it ragged and tired. And they find themselves at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, and they know they're not going to be able to get back. They finally make it to the Pacific Ocean. And because they're not going to get back, what they're going to have to do is make a fort and stay the winter. Wherever they would make a fort, they would plant the American flag. They were establishing the United States of America in the New World. And at that moment, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, with all the authority of the President of the United States, who had all the military authority to say this is where America will be, decide to establish America through an incredibly American idea. They took a vote. They gave everybody in the Corps of Discovery a vote. Where will we put the fort? Where will we establish America? Will it be on this side of the river or this side of the river? And everybody got a vote. Everybody got a vote, including Sacagawea and including York, William Clark's African-American enslaved man. The first time that a woman, a Native American, or an African-American had anything resembling a vote in the United States of America was 100 years before the rest of the world caught up. Can you believe that maybe why God is taking us into uncharted territory is because he wants the church to show the world what the future should be like? Can you dare to believe that the reason why we are on this precipice isn't to go back and try to preserve something, but to go forward and show the way? Because you know who we are? We are the people who know that the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever and ever and ever. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Don't you wish we had a choir, right? We are the ones who know that. We know what's coming. And so with the confidence of knowing that we are the ones who are following the God of the future, why are we trying to go back? That's the leadership that's needed today. It's going to require you to learn as you go. It's going to require you to let go of the things that brought you here. It's going to require you to lead in a completely different way with voices who have been long marginalized and forgotten. It's going to require you to lead through experiments and trials and things that feel like they're going to fail. And it's going to require you to have the courage to keep going until the day comes when God's kingdom will come and God's will be done on earth and in all your little pieces of the earth as it is in heaven. Amen.